What if the Great Flood did not erase everything? We are taught that the waters came to cleanse, to turn the clock back to zero, and to wash away the corruption of an ancient world. It is a story of total destruction, a definitive end to a chapter of history that was never meant to be read again. But what if the reset was a failure? What if the deluge missed something? The silence of the aftermath is heavy, yet the records that follow tell a different story. They speak of giants, of entities that should have been buried under miles of silt and salt, yet somehow walked the earth once more. If the world was wiped clean, how did these markers of the pre-flood era manifest again? This is not just a question of ancient texts or forgotten myths. It forces us to confront a terrifying possibility, that the destruction was never absolute. Scholars often stumble over the silence. The texts go quiet the moment the wood touched dry land. There is no celebration of a new beginning, only a void where the history of the survivors should be. This is where the theory of the genetic stowaway takes root. It suggests the corruption was not an external force that could be drowned, but something woven into the very marrow of the human line. If the vessel of salvation was also the carrier of the original infection, then the flood did not erase the threat. It merely acted as a filter. It preserved the seed of what it was meant to extinguish. Consider the implication. The ark was not just a sanctuary for the innocent. It was a transport for the ancient rot. The corruption did not survive the flood. It traveled through it, waiting for the right moment to surface in the new world. The traditional narrative demands a clean break. It insists that the waters were absolute, a total erasure of everything that came before. Yet, the sudden reappearance of giants in later accounts creates a jarring, impossible contradiction. If the world was truly wiped clean, how did these physical markers of the pre-flood era manifest again? We are not talking about shadows or myths, but entities like the Enoch, whose very existence defies the logic of a total purge. Their presence forces us to confront a reality that the history books ignore. If the destruction was meant to be total, then their arrival is not just a historical anomaly, it is a failure of the reset itself. How does a creature of the old world cross the threshold of the new? The silence of the texts regarding this transition is deafening. It suggests that the destruction was either bypassed by design or simply ignored by the architects of our recorded history. This is the point where the narrative of salvation collapses, revealing a world that was never as empty as we were led to believe. If the reset was absolute, then these physical markers should not exist. We find them embedded in the strata of our history, anomalies that refuse to align with the story of a drowned world. Consider the architectural remnants that predate the new era, or the artifacts that defy the technological timeline of the survivors. These are not mere coincidences. They are physical evidence that the old world left a footprint on the new. How did such heavy, tangible proof survive the crushing depths of the flood? This is the critical failure of the purge. It suggests that the destruction was not a total erasure, but a selective event that left the most dangerous elements intact. We are looking at a world that was never truly wiped clean. Instead, it was a landscape where the old foundations were repurposed, and the ancient markers were allowed to persist. This forces a shift in our understanding. The flood was not a finality. It was a containment experiment that failed to hold. The existence of these markers proves that the past was never buried. It was merely waiting. Look closely at the records. The accounts of the deluge are exhaustive, detailing every drop and every day of the descent. Then, the water recedes. The ark touches solid ground, and the narrative hits a wall of silence. This is not a lack of ink or a shortage of parchment. It is a deliberate void. Why would the chroniclers detail the destruction of the world with such precision, only to gloss over the immediate aftermath of the landing? This silence is the most suspicious element of the entire account. It creates a vacuum where history should be, a gap that suggests the survivors were not merely stepping into a clean, empty world. They were stepping into a reality that required immediate, urgent management. What were they hiding? The absence of detail implies an event or a presence that could not be recorded without shattering the narrative of a fresh start. This silence is not empty. It is heavy with the weight of what was deliberately left out of the story, signaling that the most important part of the journey happened exactly when the pen stopped moving. If the silence in the texts hides a truth, It is because the threat was never merely external. We must abandon the idea of monsters lurking in the caves and look instead at the biology of the survivors themselves. The theory of the genetic stowaway changes the entire scope of the conflict. It suggests that the corruption was not something the Ark encountered, but something it carried within its own passengers. Imagine a biological imprint, a hidden sequence woven into the very bloodlines that were meant to repopulate the Earth. This is the ultimate subversion of the narrative. The corruption was not an intruder, it was a passenger. It bypassed the cleansing of the waters by hiding in the one place the flood could not reach, the human code. This shifts the focus from the world outside to the biology within. If the infection was embedded in the blood, then the reset was doomed, from the moment the vessel touched land. We are not talking about a failed containment of geography, but a failed containment of humanity itself. Consider the vessel itself. For millennia, we have viewed the Ark as a sanctuary, a symbol of divine preservation and the ultimate act of salvation. But if the corruption was genetic, this perspective collapses. The Ark was not merely a lifeboat, it was a delivery system. It functioned as a sealed, controlled environment that protected its passengers from the external purge. But in doing so, it also shielded the infection. Think of the irony. The very structure built to ensure the survival of life became the perfect incubator for the survival of the corruption. It was a closed loop. Whatever was carried inside those walls was guaranteed to reach the new world, shielded by the same miracle that kept the passengers alive. This turns the entire concept of the flood on its head. The vessel was not a barrier against the past. It was a bridge. It bridged the gap between the old world and the new, carrying the dormant biological code across the threshold of the waters. If the Ark was the carrier, then the contamination was not an accident. It was a passenger, invited and protected, ensuring that the reset would be fundamentally compromised before the first foot touched dry land. The sanctuary was, in fact, the source of the infection. If the Ark was the carrier, then the flood was never an eraser. It was a filter. Think of the mechanics involved. A filter is designed to remove impurities, but it is only as effective as its mesh. If the corruption was woven into the very bloodlines of the passengers, then the water could not touch it. The flood swept away the physical landscape, the cities, and the external manifestations of the old world, but it left the internal architecture of the survivors untouched. This is the source of the intellectual shock. The flood acted as a sieve that caught the innocent and the corrupted alike, carrying both across the divide. It did not purge the earth of the infection. It isolated the infection within a protected environment, ensuring its survival, preserving the very thing it was meant to destroy in a sterile, controlled vacuum. If the corruption was successfully transported across the waters, why the silence? History records a strange, quiet interval before the giants emerged again. If the infection was present from the moment the Ark landed, it should have manifested immediately. Instead, we see a gap of generations. This delay is the most critical piece of the puzzle. It suggests the corruption was not a static state, but a dormant trigger. Think of it as a biological time bomb, buried deep within the genetic code, waiting for specific environmental or developmental conditions to activate. It was not enough for the corruption to survive the journey. It had to wait for the world to stabilize, for the bloodlines to intermingle, and for the right pressure to be applied. The giants did not appear by chance. They appeared when the latent code finally hit its threshold. This implies that the post-flood world was never truly free of the past. It was merely a host, waiting for the infection to reach maturity. The delay was not a sign of safety. It was the quiet preparation of a parasite. The Enochim were not a new creation, but the inevitable result of a timer that had been ticking since the first day the survivors stepped onto dry land. The timer is not just a concept. It is a biological reality that demands our attention now. If that dormant trigger was programmed to reactivate under specific conditions, we must ask if those conditions are already present. Look at the world today. The silence that followed the flood was not an absence of the threat, but a period of gestation. Now, the gestation is over. The symptoms are no longer hidden in ancient texts. They are woven into the fabric of our own physical reality. We feel the shift in the air. A subtle misalignment in the human experience that defies simple explanation. It is as if the dormant code is finally responding to the environment, reaching a threshold that was set millennia ago. This is not a distant historical curiosity. It is an active, encroaching pressure. Every heartbeat, every cellular mutation, every unexplained instinct is a potential sign that the trigger has been pulled. The parasite is no longer waiting for the right conditions. It is creating them. Something that was meant to be erased is waking up, and it is doing so from within. The existence of the Enoch is the smoking gun that shatters the myth of a total reset. If the waters truly scoured the earth of every trace of the corruption, these entities should not exist. Yet, they appear in the records with terrifying clarity, standing as living proof that the purge was bypassed. Their presence is not a mere anomaly. It is a direct challenge to the narrative of salvation. How could a world wiped clean produce beings that embody the very traits intended for extinction? The answer is a cold, hard reality. The destruction was ignored. The Anakim were not a new mutation or a random occurrence. They were the survivors of a filter that failed to catch the most dangerous elements. Every mention of them in ancient accounts acts as a jagged piece of evidence, piercing the veil of the post-flood era. They walked the land, claimed territory, and defied the silence. Their very existence confirms that the corruption was not erased, but merely relocated. It was a failure of containment that left the world vulnerable. The Anakim are the physical markers of a broken promise, proving that the threat was never truly gone, only waiting for the dust to settle. The failure of the purge was not an accident of nature, but a calculated act of preservation. Look closer at the vessel itself. The Ark was not merely a sanctuary for the innocent. It functioned as a vault for forbidden ancient knowledge that was never intended to survive the cleansing waters. This changes the entire nature of the event. If the vessel of salvation was also the carrier of the original corruption, then the flood was compromised from the start. The architects of this preservation understood that the old world could not be fully erased if its secrets remained intact. They smuggled the blueprints of the decay across the threshold of the new world, ensuring that the influence would endure. This was a high-stakes betrayal. By shielding this knowledge, they turned the Ark into a Trojan horse, carrying the seeds of the past into a future that was supposed to be clean. The preservation of these secrets meant the corruption was not just a biological stowaway, but a cognitive one. It was a deliberate sabotage of the reset. The Ark did not just save life. It ensured the continuity of the very darkness it was built to escape. If the Ark was a vessel for the forbidden, then the flood itself was a failed experiment in containment. The water receded, but the threat remained. We have lived under the illusion of a clean slate, believing the purge was absolute, yet the evidence points to a catastrophic oversight. The reset did not work. It was a containment breach on a global scale. Think of the sheer scale of the effort, the waters, the destruction, all rendered moot by the simple fact that the core corruption survived. The experiment was designed to isolate and eradicate, yet it preserved the very thing it sought to destroy. This is the shattering realization. The safety we assume is a fiction. The flood was not the end of the old world. It was a transition, a filter that allowed the infection to pass through into the new era. The experiment failed, and we are the ones left to inhabit the wreckage of a world that was never truly purged. The failure of the flood was not merely a breach of containment. It was a fundamental oversight of the root cause. The water washed away the surface, but it left the foundation of the old world intact. This corruption was not a foreign invader that could be purged. It was woven into the very fabric of the post-flood reality. It was a structural defect in the new world's design. We look for external signs, for giants or physical remnants, but the true infection is deeper. It is embedded in the logic of our existence, a persistent variable that the purge never reached. This realization strips away the comfort of progress. If the root cause was never touched, then every advancement, every structure, and every society built since the waters receded has been constructed upon a flawed, corrupted base. There is no escaping this. The rot is not an anomaly, it is a feature of the current world. We are left with the cold, hard fact that the purge was a superficial correction for a terminal condition. The core of the problem remains exactly where it was before the rain began. We are not living in a new world. We are living in the continuation of an uncorrected error. The era of the giants was merely the first phase of an ongoing adaptation. The Anakim were not the final form of the corruption. They were a clumsy, overt display of a power that had not yet learned to hide. When the physical manifestations became too obvious, the threat changed its strategy. It retreated from the battlefield. It abandoned the sword and the display of raw, towering strength for something far more effective: silence. The evolution of this evil is marked by its transition from the external to the internal. It stopped trying to conquer the world through force and began to influence it through proximity. This is the shift that defines our reality. The corruption no longer walks in the open, casting shadows that can be measured or fought. It has become subtle, woven into the decision-making processes of institutions and the quiet impulses of the individual. It is no longer a war of territory, but a war of infiltration. The threat has learned the ultimate lesson of survival. To remain undetected is to remain invincible. We are no longer watching for monsters on the horizon. We are living in the presence of a predator that has successfully disguised itself as the environment itself. The corruption now operates behind a veil of absolute normalcy. It does not need to overthrow governments. It simply occupies the roles that define them. Look at the mechanisms of modern power. The subtle shifts in policy, the recurring patterns in global crises, the way narratives are manufactured to steer public consensus. These are not coincidences. They are the fingerprints of a system that has learned to mimic the very structures it intends to subvert. The predator has become the architect of the cage. It influences events from the boardroom, the laboratory, and the digital stream, ensuring that every move we make toward progress inadvertently serves its hidden agenda. There is no resistance, because there is no visible enemy to fight. The threat is masked by the mundane, hidden in plain sight within the routines of daily life. It has successfully colonized the decision-making processes of our civilization, turning our own institutions into instruments of our containment. We are not being conquered, we are being managed. Every event that feels like a deviation from the norm is merely a calculated adjustment in a long-term strategy that has been unfolding since the waters receded. The veil is not just a disguise. It is the primary weapon of a force that has mastered the art of being everywhere at once while remaining entirely invisible. The focus must now shift from the world around you to the world within you. If the corruption was never truly purged, then the boundary between the observer and the observed dissolves. Look at your own biology. We treat the human body as a clean slate, a product of linear evolution, but what if that premise is the ultimate deception? Consider the anomalies in your own history, the impulses that feel alien to your intent, the recurring patterns of behavior that seem to defy your conscious control. These are not merely quirks of personality. They are the potential echoes of a legacy that was supposed to be extinguished millennia ago. You are not just a witness to this history. You are a participant in its continuation. The failure of the Great Purge was not a failure of external containment, but a failure to recognize the carrier. If the corruption is woven into the fabric of our existence, then the search for the enemy ends in the mirror. You are looking at a continuation of a story that should have ended with the rising tides. It is a biological fact, etched into the very code, waiting for the trigger. Think of this not as a distant threat, but as a silent passenger riding within your own genetic code. It is the passenger that never speaks, yet constantly steers the ship. It sits in the quiet spaces of your cells, a legacy of a catastrophe that failed to finish its work. You feel it in the moments where your reactions do not align with your logic, where a sudden, sharp impulse overrides your better judgment. It is an internal violation, a piece of something else living inside the architecture of your own being. You are the host for a history that was meant to be drowned. This is not a metaphor. It is a biological reality, a dormant trigger waiting for the right environmental shift to wake up. Every breath you take, every decision you make, carries the weight of this stowaway. It is an intruder that has become indistinguishable from the self, blurring the line between your own intent and the echoes of a prehistoric corruption. You are not just a person, you are a vessel. The reset failed because it left the passenger behind, and now, that passenger is you. Stop looking for the end of the story in dusty texts or ancient ruins. The narrative did not conclude thousands of years ago. It is breathing right now. Every shadow in your city, every unexplained shift in the global order, is the current manifestation of that same, unpurged source. This is not history. History is a record of things that have finished. This is an active, ongoing event. The floodwaters receded, but the infection remained, evolving into the silence of your modern world. You are currently living through the final act of a failed containment. Look at the world outside your window. The patterns are repeating. The influence is accelerating. The reset was not a solution. It was a delay. And the time for the delay is over. You are not reading about the past. You are witnessing the present. The corruption is not coming. It is here. It is happening now.